We're only in the 3rd chapter of Mark's Gospel. How much trouble could one person get into? Well, apparently a lot. For the last 2.5 chapters, Jesus has been preaching the good news of the arrival of God's imperial rule, healing folks, and gathering disciples. But because he wasn't sticking to the script that society had written for him, he was beginning to draw criticism. You see, he and his disciples didn't fast like others did. And he broke tradition by doing things on the Sabbath that others felt he shouldn't be doing, like gathering food to keep him from going hungry and healing sick people. He seemed to feel that people were worshiping Sabbath traditions more than they were worshiping God. And while he was at it, he affirmed people as forgiven. He probably knew that his words and ways would create a stir. Fresh approaches to life always do. More than likely, he expected as much from the religious authorities, but I wonder how it must have felt when his own family showed up trying to pressure him because they felt he had lost his mind. When the world rejects you, you should still be able to find support in your family, shouldn't you? Well, Jesus wasn't the first person who had ever been mistreated, wronged, or even victimized by his blood kin. In fact, we need go no further in the Bible than the 2nd generation of humanity when Cain murdered his brother Abel out of a sense of jealousy. And there's the Sodom and Gomorrah incident when Lot thought it would be a swell idea to offer his 2 daughters to be raped by the city's men. And let's not forget Abraham, who cast one of his sons and the son's mother into the desert as if they were a bag of trash, and was willing to sacrifice his other son, whom he decided was also disposable. And there was Abraham's great-grandson, Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his own brothers. No, Jesus wasn't the first person to have family members that didn't understand him and weren't willing to try. Family members who were embarrassed by him, resentful of him, and who tried to shape and mold him to what they thought best for him. Jesus wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last either. According to a recent report, almost 700,000 LGBT adults in the U.S. have received conversion therapy, about half of whom were subjected to it as adolescents. 16,000 LGBT youth will receive conversion therapy from a licensed healthcare professional before they reach the age of 18. And an estimated 57,000 youth will receive conversion therapy from religious or spiritual advisors before they reach the age of 18. According to another study, LGBTQ young people are 120% more likely to experience homelessness than non-LGBT youth, with family conflict and rejection over sexual orientation and gender identity cited as the most common cause of all youth homelessness. Yes, the queer community knows full well what it's like to be undervalued and rejected by family. And so this morning's text speaks to the heart of our very being. Many of us have been shaped and shamed and judged by our peers, but even more tragically by our own families. But Jesus has good news for anyone who has family members who think they have lost their minds. Family members who try to take charge of us as Jesus' family did with him. Jesus said we get to choose our family. That would have been an especially radical statement to a people who was devoted to genealogies, a people who had been taught that God's grace was granted by one's ancestry. Jesus upended that ancient Jewish idea by de-emphasizing the status of one's bloodline while stressing the importance of obedience to God's will. A community of people who shared the same values then became one's family. Again, this is something that LGBTQ people have known for quite some time. In fact, when I was young, identifying someone as family meant they were also gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. It meant that the person was someone with whom you could feel safe and affirmed. It was a family that provided a sense of well-being, confidence, and self-esteem while combating isolation. That's what family is supposed to do. But it's worth noting that choosing a new family is easier for some people than for others. Sarah New was born in Malaysia, and she moved to the U.S. with her Chinese family when she was 10 years old. She writes, "White queer narratives tend to involve discarding one's family in favor of one's self-liberation and newly chosen family. But such a narrative is not an easy option for those of us for whom our families are all we really have. To lose our family feels like losing, as Jesus said, life itself. Separating myself from my family feels like a slow death." I share her words only to remind us that choosing a new family is not as easily done for some folks as it is for others. Whereas some people may have been anticipating their liberation for a whole lifetime, for others it may be a very, very painful process. And these people may need support and affirmation from their community more than ever before. Our text closes this morning with Jesus making the broad and open-ended declaration that his family consisted of those who do the will of God. It's meant to be a statement of inclusion. But unfortunately, there are people who would turn it into one of exclusion. These are the people who feel certain they know what the will of God is and feel called to impose that will on others. They are the religious folk and family members who challenged Jesus in his day. And they are the anonymous phone callers at the church I sometimes get who challenge me with their interpretation of God's will for my life. But this is what I believe is God's will. I believe God's will is to love yourself by living your life as authentically as you possibly can, tearing down the closets of fear that have imprisoned you, and embracing the person that has been fearfully and wonderfully made, as the psalmist writes. For me, God's will is to love others by lifting them up physically, by feeding them, and spiritually by affirming them. And I believe God's will for us is to rest in the promise that if we seek God, we shall find God in the most surprising of places imaginable. And when we find others who endeavor to do God's will, then we should embrace them as Jesus did, because we have at last found the family God intended for us all along. Amen.